Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and co-host Graham. How are you doing, Graham?
Great, thank you. How are you?
Wonderful. I'm really excited for this. So this is going to be our third episode of Searching for Dragons, where we've been deep diving into the works of Antonin Artaud. But this is sort of the big one, right? Like, this is the one when people who don't know Artaud, this is the one they may have heard of. This is his book that had the most kind of lasting infamy and fame and kind of impact culturally. And when people think of Artaud, they often reference this work, even more so than many of his plays, right?
Yeah, I mean, he did only have two plays that he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
He had a few scenarios, I guess, that he wrote as well. But yeah, the theater in its double, the big work is sort of his quintessential distilled theory on the theater of cruelty.
Right. And yeah, he includes in this his two manifestos, I believe,
Yeah,
on the
both
theater of cruelty.
manifestos.
And this is all born out of earlier stuff. And so actually let's set the scene. So let's talk about where Artaud is at in his life and his creative output and what leads to the production of this theater of cruelty and then eventually this collection of essays.
Right. So we're gonna have to take a little step back in time to about 1926 to 1929. This is when Artaud had broken away from the Surrealists, along with Robert Aaron and Roger Vitrec, and they formed what was known as the Alfred Jarry Theater, a nod to the symbolist writer Alfred Jarry. And these were very important productions. They had four seasons, and they were sort of like mini scenarios that were presented. And a very main focus of these, he called them attempt at mysticism. And a main focus of the productions would be the dismemberment of mannequins on stage.
Oh wow. So I just want to take a second to highlight the significance of this because for those of us who are familiar with the more ancient Greek rites and Greek theater, will immediately be drawn to the imagery and mythology of Dionysus, the patron god of the theater, who is dismembered by the Titans and then commits dismemberment several times in his myths. Like his maenads often commit dismemberment. They murder the king Pentheus in the Euripides play, The Bacchae. They dismember Orpheus, and his head rolls down the ocean to the island of Sappho, where it becomes a totem for prophecy. You know, they there's this constant theme within the bucket called of this dismemberment and this ritual too, right? We would see within the maenads where they are it's called the sparagmos, where they're taking an animal and they would ritually dismember it and then consume the live living flesh. It's a very controversial idea. It's definitely something that's mythologically significant. Now, whether or not these women were doing that, it's hard to say. It's like, is this a pure allegory or are these women super high on drugs and ripping and eating animals apart? All of that, I believe, is a possibility, right? And we don't have evidence enough. So, but it's a wild image and it's a magical image and it's a theatrical image. So, Artaud having this connection where they're ripping apart these fake human bodies, which is almost like later on in sacrificial rites, you create these effigies, these stand ins for the animals that will be destroyed or dismembered or burned or ripped apart. And then the effigy takes on this whole thing. But within the rites of the sacrifice, the effigy is a living being. It is right a true soul, right? Because this usually these are born out of animistic religions or spiritualities. So when they sacrifice the effigy, they are sacrificing a living animal, just in an altered form. And what I see from Artaud is this is what he's doing with these mannequins. He's committing a ritualized sacrifice, and these are a totem, an effigy, a human effigy, and he's connecting back to that primal sort of Bacchic theater of the ancient Greeks.
He really is, and he says increasingly throughout his writing during this period, he is adamant about creating a theater to which the masses can flock to undergo a series like a ritual of communal, spiritual, and corporeal enlightenment and purification.
Purification is the key word. So he's really taking it back to the Dionysiaca, right? Those classic theatrical festivals from which our Western forms of theater originate.
Exactly. And so he starts having some disagreements with Roger Vitrac, and they end up parting ways. And Artaud takes this theory of this concept of dismemberment and transforms it into his theory of cruelty. And the cruelty is very complex and nuanced. He describes it a bit more in some letters later on in the text. But a lot of it has to do with the theater of cruelty, with shocking the spectator into seeing the baseness of their world and reinstilling them by liberating their individual instinctual energy.
Again, this takes us immediately back to the ancient Greek theater. And we're immediately confronted with this idea of the tragedy, the goat songs, right? These stories of cathartic reliefs, of purgation, where you have a community that experiences this gross communal shame vicariously through the element of the theatrical, and they experience this kind of imagined violence, and by experiencing it through this percepted lens, they are released from it. They can overcome it. They can imagine it, and it is no longer this terrifying other. It is reduced and transformed, right?
Exactly. Well said.
Love it. And so yeah, Artaud is clearly in this ancient magical tradition as well as firmly within this theatrical tradition.
Yeah, he's got a foot in both doors, so to speak, or a hand in both bags.
He has yet to abandon the theater at this point. This is him being his most radical, right?
He never really does abandon the theater. Later in his life, he does more solo performances and and small performances that he directs with a few close actor friends. So he kind of just reimagines what he thinks theater is later on, I suppose.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. Sorry.
Yeah,
I just feel like he no longer is trying, like, because at one point he has this big theater, they're forming these massive productions. All of that is gone by the time we have Artaud the Sorcerer.
That's true. It is. He's approaching it from a very different lens.
Okay, so let's go back. So we're back. He splits from these... Sorry, go ahead.
I cut you off.
No, you continue. You know where you were.
Okay, so now we come to 1930, and it's about 1930 to 1934 when he writes these texts, these essays for the theater and its double. The book itself is not published collective, like in a full collection, until 1938, but the individual essays are published through the NRF, La Nouvelle Revue Française, from 1930 to 1934. And they cause a big stir amongst the public and the theater goers at the time.
So, okay, explain this to me. Like, why were these so controversial? What are people offended by? I mean, I'm trying to imagine just because we're so removed from the world of 1930s France, right? What is going to
Yeah.
be offensive then may not be offensive now. Why are they having such a hard time with Artaud?
So in the 1930s, theater is very much like a bourgeois, profit-oriented, complacent melodrama sort of scenario. And they're not really doing high intellectual stuff. And it's very much like dialogue, talking heads, fancy dressed up talking heads, essentially, talking about
Right.
talking about bedroom manners.
Yeah, take four people from the aristocracy, put them in a one state, one one set play. All you have to do is get four really nice costumes. Go.
Yeah. And then we have Artaud comes along who says, I quote, "We cannot go on prostituting the idea of the theater, the only value of which is in its excruciating magical relation to reality and danger."
Beautiful. Wow. So he really had his issues with money and greed.
Yeah, he
Beautiful.
did. He saw the value in being able to sustain your art, and he struggled with that with addiction, being able to properly fund his productions. But he thought that excess greed led to excess of anything really led to a division between you and yourself.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. So continue. Where are we where's our to go from here?
So from here, he's still in Paris. He's writing, and he is still acting in the cinema. That's mostly how he makes his money is through film acting. His biggest film appearances would have been in the late 1920s. He was in Napoleon as well as The Passion of Joan d'Arc.
I've
So
seen clips of the Passion of Jeanne d'Arc. You can find it on YouTube, anyone who's interested.
it's
And Artaud is such an intense person. He is the perfect kind of actor for a silent film, just because he can say so much with his body language alone.
yeah, he's very expressive. And so yeah, so now we come to the 1930s to 1934, and he hasn't staged any productions yet. He's just writing these theories and sort of giving lectures, to, speaking about the essays and lectures and stuff.
Right. Okay. So, like, explain this. How is there? So there's like a big art scene in Paris that he's become kind of prominent in, and he's moved more into this position as sort of a philosophical leader. Would you say?
Not so much a leader, more of like a black sheep outlier,
Okay.
in the sense that his parting with the surrealists wasn't very pleasant. Um, he's remained friends with them, but it was a very strained relationship over the years. And they accused him of bestiality and things like that. In they published a scathing anti-Artaud piece after he announcing his official expulsion from the Surrealists, and I think it was very unnecessary and
Yeah, that sounds
inflammatory.
insane. Holy crap.
A bit inflammatory for no reason, in my opinion. All because people didn't understand maybe what he was talking about or the extreme of what he was talking about. It's hard to say. I wasn't I wasn't there, but um,
I mean, it seems to be, from what I've read, a lot of it was political, right?
a lot of it was very political. But the point is, he was respected in these circles. He was
Yeah.
not like he was an outlier, but a respected outlier.
Yeah, so people were interested and they wanted to know what he had to say. He was kind of like this shocking oddity that they were both amazed and affronted by and disgusted by.
This whirlwind of passion and fury.
All right.
So let's dive into the text, maybe.
Okay, yeah, let's bring up the text here. So you have the quintessential edition here, right?
Yeah, so we'll be reading passages from this translation. It's translated by Mary Caroline Richards in 1958, and is considered by many still to be the quintessential translation. If you can get aside from the fact that there's the Americanized spelling of theater, it's, it's a pet peeve of mine, but that's neither here nor there. It's a wonderful edition. I have another translation. I would say that this one is
The
much.
superior.
It's more pleasant to read. Feels more fluid.
Cool.
So it starts with the preface, the theater and culture. He says, we need to live first of all, to believe in what makes us live, and that something makes us live. To believe that whatever is produced from the mysterious depths of ourselves need not forever haunt us as an exclusively digestive concern. I mean that if it is important for us to eat first of all, it is even more important for us not to waste, in the sole concern for eating, our simple power of being hungry. If confusion is the sign of the times, I see at the root of this confusion a rupture between things and words, between things and the ideas and signs that are their representation.
Wow. We need to believe in something that makes us live, right? Like we have to give ourselves purpose. It's such a profound, and the mysterious depths of ourselves need not forever haunt us. But it's like at the same, oh wow. Yeah, I really like this. This is interesting stuff. What do you think of this, Grant?
I think that, he's talking about that primordial force of life, tapping into that supreme power. And if we believe in that, then we aren't afraid of ourselves. We aren't afraid of anything anymore.
Right. I also keep thinking, right, we have to remember that Artaud is this occulted magician figure, and that he's connecting the sacrificial rite, I believe, of the dismemberment with then the eating. Because if we think about it in terms of the Orphic cosmogony, something like Fanes, this divine being who is representative of the totality of creation, who then dismembers himself, and then we are it consuming ourselves, right? In this constant outpouring of abuse, of cruelty, right? And I think Artaud is really connecting to this imagery. And I keep thinking too of all of this occulted magical rites about eating, like with Christ, which is also a Dionysic type figure. You have this imagery of eating the body and consuming the blood, where he becomes the scapegoat upon the cross. And this is an image that we know Artaud is deeply connected to because he saw himself later as Christ, right?
Definitely. Definitely. And this thing, if confusion is the sign of the times, I see at the root of this confusion a rupture between things and words, between things and the ideas and signs that are the representation. He's talking about how the force of symbols have been stripped away, and they're just etchings in the sand waiting to be washed away, and they're not magical and important anymore.
Well, this is something that you see that often does happen, and it is upsetting, and it is very transformative, and it leads to a breakdown of knowledge. And what I mean is that, like they talk about this in philosophy, I think what he's getting at is you see this often related to in memes, where an image becomes so kind of removed from itself that it loses all meaning or takes on all meaning, and it becomes completely just devoid of meaning, right? Like there's that famous meme where they're talking about first you have Caesar, then you have the Caesar
Yeah,
salad.
yeah, yeah. The different transformation of the sign into the simulacrum.
Exactly, right? This breakdown of meaning, this loss, right? This disillusion between the original idea and the invoked, now what we're talking about, right? Now that specific word is not able to communicate, but like we've extended it so far that it's like lost its foundational base now, right?
There's all this obfuscation around it.
Exactly. And I think that's what he's hinting at, right? It's a sign that, it's also something you always hear this too. A lot of older people complaining because the words that they, as they understood them, have taken on new meaning, for better or for worse, whether we like it or not, right? I think it's something like, oh God. Anyway, there's so many examples I'm sure that people can think of, but
Yeah,
things change, meanings grow, and then there's a disconnection in understanding, and it leads to some frustration, but it's that inevitability, right?
definitely. Definitely. So next he says, if our life lacks brimstone, a constant magic, it is because we choose to observe our acts and lose ourselves in consideration of their imagined form instead of being impelled by their force. And this faculty is an exclusively human one. I would even say that it is this infection of the human which contaminates ideas that should have remained divine. For far from believing that man invented the supernatural and the divine, I think it is man's age old intervention which has ultimately corrupted the divine within him.
Yeah, that's so powerful. This is something we see with a lot of these kind of magical people, this recognition of this divine form, right? The fact that we're all connected to this true image, that our soul, our individual, our true self, right, is this undying form that has persisted across all of creation. And that to recognize and embody this is to become that perfected person, to become that body without organs, that thing that can persist after death that Artaud is so after, right? Where he literally talks about how after he's able to do this creative magic, that the world is out to destroy him.
Yeah.
Right?
And I like the fact that this faculty is an exclusively human one. It's the human hyper rationalization of everything we do that separates us from the power of what we do.
That's such a truism. And I think that's also what they're getting at in stories like the Garden of Eden, right? What did we lose from the animal, right? George Bataille also talks about this kind of thing. What we lost from our ancient selves, the ancient versions of ourselves, is the ability to be, like, to imagine, like, to be a part of nature, to trust in our instincts, to have that instinctual set of selves. Now we have permanently separated ourselves in order to develop our intellect, in a sense, and that separation can never be healed, you know, at least not back to what it was.
No, scary stuff.
Yeah.
So he says all ideas about life must be revised in a period when nothing any longer adheres to life. It is this painful cleavage which is responsible for the revenge of things. The poetry which is no longer within us and which we no longer succeed in finding in things suddenly appears on the wrong side. Consider the unprecedented number of crimes whose perverse gratuitousness is explained only by our powerlessness to take complete possession of life. If the theater has been created as an outlet for our repressions, the agonized poetry expressed in its bizarre corruptions of the facts of life demonstrates that life's intensity is still intact and asks only to be better directed. But no matter how loudly we clamor for magic in our lives, we are really afraid of pursuing an existence entirely under its influence and sign.
Yeah, magic is terrifying in a sense, right? It requires you to be in this disciplined mode of action and moving forward into that creative space of creation, right? It's that act when you look at the Fool card, like in the tarot, right? The fool is taking that leap into creation. He sees the cliff and he's walking off the edge, right? And it's both a destruction in the beginning, but he has no way of knowing. And this is what I think he's getting at, to be in that life that is truly ruled by magic. It's to let go and to just trust in the flow of that will, that true will, right? And to be in that magical creative state of just of trust and imagination and willpower. And that's something that we have to believe in ourselves, and we have to allow ourselves to do. It's like, it's, on one hand, it's the hardest act and the easiest act. It's like our doubt is what prevents us. Our overthinking is what prevents us. You know, so much of ritual is about removing the thought. You know, breaking us down to those points where we don't think about things and we just act from a place of will and love. You know.
It's really cool.
It's so cool.
And I kind of lost it, but
No worries. You know, it's, and this idea, right? The revenge of things, the poetry which is no longer within us and which we no longer succeed in finding in things, suddenly appears on their wrong side. Consider the unprecedented number of crimes whose perverse gratuitousness is explained only by our powerlessness to take complete possession of life. So he's saying, like, so much of our crime and our outpouring is just a reaction. It is a desire for something. It's that desperation, their cries of help, you know, and of frustration and anxiety, you know, and it's this and it comes from this inability. And he's getting at this magical thing, right? What is the point of theater? Theater allows us to deal with and transform the anxiety. It's like a magical ritualized act that prepares you and puts you into that state of true creation, you know, where you can act without restraint.
Exactly. That's really well said.
You know, you can take that leap like that fool into that creative place, right? Regardless of whether it's into the depths of death or into a grand new beginning.
Definitely.
Anyway, so wild to think about.
It is. So this is a bit of a longer passage, but I think it's important. He says, a protest against the idea of culture as distinct from life, as if there were culture on one side and life on the other, as if true culture were not a refined means of understanding and exercising life. The library at Alexandria can be burnt down. There are forces above and beyond papyrus. We may be temporarily be deprived of our ability to discover these forces, but their energy will not be suppressed. It is good that our excessive facilities are no longer available, that forms fall into oblivion. A culture without space or time, restrained only by the capacity of our own nerves, will reappear with all the more energy. It is right that from time to time cataclysms occur which compel us to return to nature, i.e., to rediscover life. The old totemism of animals, stones, objects capable of discharging thunderbolts, costumes impregnated with bestial essences, everything in short that might determine, disclose, and direct the secret forces of the universe, is for us a dead thing, from which we derive nothing but static and aesthetic profit, the profit of an audience, not of an actor.
This is so freaking what? Oh, wow. This is okay. So I got to reread the first passage because that was
Yeah.
just so amazing. A protest against the idea of culture as distinct from life. As if there were culture on one side and life on the other, as if true culture were not a refined means of understanding and exercising life. That is so beautifully well said and so well put. And this is something that a lot of us fail to recognize. This is why the culture wars are war, and why it's such a profound thing, why people obsess over things like subculture, or they obsess over things like cultural appropriation. On one hand, we have to remember that these are created images that are in this ever state of flux, and that we're not bound by them, but there's this magical unfolding of story and human connectivity, right? This thing that is born out of these primal human loves and connections, and like he says, culture is that exercising of life. And this is why it's so important that we take these cultural forces and use them for our own advantage, right? That we exercise them for ourselves and we don't allow ourselves to be bound and dictated. And why these culture wars are such a massive thing in our current culture, right?
Definitely. That's well said.
And I love this whole image here he talks about, right? The library at Alexandria can be burnt down. There are forces above and beyond papyrus. Beautiful. Because it's like, if that idea was found and put into practice by humanity, it can be found and put into practice again. That was a real lived human experience. The person who wrote it down is simply the vehicle of transmission. So that knowledge has not been lost. It exists, right? It can be found. It's still out there. And it also makes me think there's this, like, when we look at when we come down to these culture wars and this transformation of stuff, like, so much of our magical history is defined by this persecution by Christian authorities to try and stop magical thinking or transform magical thinking, to be able to confine it into religious modes so that it can be utilized and refocused. And it has always fundamentally failed. And we keep having these new incredible people born across time who make the same magical connections, and often they're not reading these ancient texts. They're not connected to one another. They're just human beings who are connected to the natural flow of nature and are divining the same truisms.
It's really profound that we can arrive at the same, similar spiritual conclusions, regardless of where we're from.
Right? Or very similar ideas,
Similar,
to be human is such a varied experience, but a similar experience, and there's like this, anyway, it's magical stuff. And I just love this idea too, that these ideas persist in spite of persecution or resistance, that other is still out there to challenge. And if it's been experienced once, it can be experienced again, right?
Exactly.
And it really makes me think too of this magical idea too of going to the past, of committing this kind of necromancy, of revitalization, of things like the Renaissance, of these cycles of civilization collapse and then rebirth of civilizations, or reformulations of civilization. The city falls, there's a return to nature, and then there's the reformulation and a new attempt at building. Like, this is such a primal magical image, and it's something we're going to talk about more as this text goes on.
And I love what he says here about the old totemism of animals, stones, objects capable of discharging thunderbolts, costumes impregnated with bestial essences, is for us a dead thing from which we derive nothing but static and aesthetic profit, the profit of an audience, not of an actor. It's like we've lost the magic of objects themselves.
Right. And it's important too that he uses that image of audience and actor, because what does an actor do with a prop or with a costume? He transforms himself and creates a new form, right? Through that process of magical artistic creation.
Exactly. And he says here at the bottom, yet totemism is an actor. for it moves and has been created in behalf of actors. All true culture relies upon the barbaric and primitive means of totemism, whose savage, entirely spontaneous life I wish to worship.
Oh, I love this. Again, this idea of worship of life, right? Worship of the primal nature, of the return to those the to use Artaud's words, primitive and savage, you know. And it's interesting that Artaud chooses these words because at his time, these words are still so incredibly inflammatory. And he does not mean it in that sense in any way. He's trying to, again, like, this is something that is a magical action. He's flipping the poles. He's invoking that taboo. He's transforming the meaning. He's taking primitive back and, you know, using it as a weapon against society, against non-primitive culture.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. He throughout the text there's lots of frames of like actually the European civilized culture being the true barbarian, you know, the true like barbaric savages.
What makes me think of, what was that essay we read last time from
Betrayal
Europe?
by the whites.
Thank you. Yeah, that was fantastic. It's like a continuation of themes here, right?
Yeah, very much so. In somewhere, I didn't quote the passage, but there is a quote from this text, and he says, "If anything, it is we whites who, whenever we go anywhere, are the ones who smell bad." Anyways, that's neither here nor there. Um, so in this next, I love this next passage. Every real effigy has a shadow, which is its double. And art must falter and fail from the moment the sculptor believes he has liberated the kind of shadow whose very existence will destroy his repose. Like all magic cultures expressed by appropriate hieroglyphs, the true theater has its shadows too, and of all languages and all arts, the theater is the only one left whose shadows have shattered their limitations. From the beginning, one might say its shadows did not tolerate limitations. Our petrified idea of the theater is connected with our petrified idea of a culture without shadows, where no matter which way it turns, our mind, esprit, encounters only emptiness, though space is full.
Oh, wow.
Maybe that's a good point to pause.
Yeah, there's so much, again, going back to the top passage here. Every real, and it's wild that he uses this word because I brought up this word, effigy.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I was like,
Right?
oh, she's going to love this.
Every real effigy has a shadow which is its double, and alt must falter and fail from the moment the sculptor believes he has liberated the kind of shadow whose very existence will destroy his repose. Right? So, this is that thing, okay? You must be challenged by the perception of the other, that thing that is radically different, that shadow, that darkness that can't be perceived, that moment of doubt and confusion. And there's this thing about elimination, right? When you see a lot of this in a lot of classical um, magical kind of thinking, as well as in some of the ancient spirituality like Zoroastrian thought, where there is this necessity to kind of eradicate this evil force from the universe to create this sort of flattening and this cleansing, right? But what is the result of such an outcome? When you actively logically think about this, when you remove that other, that difference, and you create this sameness, right, without contrast, and you wind up destroying, it's like he
You
says
return to cosmic loneliness and you you rend yourself apart again, right?
exactly, right. And it's like the I love how he connects to this idea that the through the symbol and the signs of language, like hieroglyphs, of ancient culture. The theater has its signs too, its shadows too. And that, but because the theater is this abstract form that incorporates movement and passion and space, it can't be bound in the same way that art and language and sign is, right? Sign exists in static form, but the human body is in flow and in time, right? Real beautiful stuff here. And it's like this idea too that the other can't be, we always want to box and exclude and define what is other, right? We want to contrast ourselves and declare what is evil or what shouldn't be done. And so there's this idea too where it's like when you do that, when you start to define what the shadow is, you limit yourself and you destroy aspects of yourself, and but when you can't, the shadow's in a state of flux, things can move in and out, right? Sometimes they can be shadows and sometimes they can be light. Anyway, just interesting stuff to think about.
Super interesting. So next he says, but the true theater, because it moves and makes use of living instruments, continues to stir up shadows where life has never ceased to grope its way. The actor does not make the same gestures twice, but he makes gestures. He moves. And although he brutalizes forms, nevertheless behind them and through their destruction, he rejoins that which outlives forms and produces their continuation. The theater, which is in no thing, but makes use of everything, gestures, sounds, words, screams, light, darkness, rediscovers itself at precisely the point where the mind requires a language to express its manifestations.
It's beautiful, right? And like getting back to what he was saying earlier about culture, theater is again just like culture, right? About this presentation of life, about the experiences of life. It's this living thing. It's just, but it's also nothing, because it incorporates everything. It has nothing, wow, it's really interesting.
It's fascinating stuff, very powerful. Speaking of life, I think the next passage is really cool.
All right, let's continue.
He says, we must believe in a sense of life renewed by the theater, a sense of life in which man fearlessly makes himself master of what does not yet exist and brings it into being. And everything that has not been born can still be brought to life if we are not satisfied to remain mere recording organisms. Furthermore, when we speak the word life, it must be understood we are not referring to life as we know it from its surface of fact, but to that fragile, fluctuating center which forms never reach. And if there is still one hellish, truly accursed thing in our time, it is our artistic dallying with forms, instead of being like victims burnt at the stake, signaling through the flames.
Holy shit. He's always so intense. I love art. But it's, oh man. And okay, we must believe in a sense of life renewed by theater. This immediately takes me back to Aeschylus, right? Why did they do the theater plays? They were part of the fertility rites to cause the seasons to change, to literally to bring about this renewal of life, to have this purgation, to perpetuate the city, the polis. So, wow.
And he said, we need to go back to that. We've lost that magical connection.
Right? And it's like a sense of life in which man fearlessly makes himself master of what does not yet exist and brings it into being. Right? What does the magician do? The true magician is this imaginary creative person, this person who is able to create those imaginary forms, put them and express them in art to bring them to fruition eventually across time and space, to create these sigilizations, these ideas, right? Like Artaud is a perfect example. He creates the theater of cruelty, which will outlive and persist him and has become a transformative cultural idiom in and of itself, an idea, right? And yeah, wow. Just love this stuff. And everything that has not been born can still be brought to life if we are not satisfied to remain mere recording organisms. You know,
So as
and
long as we're sitting here documenting our lives instead of living them, you know?
exactly. Or, you know, it's like I often think about this. I can't remember where I saw this, but someone on YouTube was being critical of capitalism, was talking about how capitalism either reduces you to a consumer or a producer. You either have to be constantly selling yourself or consuming the crap from other people. And either way, neither of these are healthy ways to be around art and to engage with art and to perceive art. You know, it winds up reducing the art and the viewer and the creator. Everything becomes reduced.
A
You know,
grand reduction.
right?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, just also this, I love this part. Furthermore, when we speak the word life, it must be understood we're not referring to life as we know it from its surface of fact, but to that fragile, fluctuating center which forms never reach. So this is a really magical, interesting idea because it immediately makes me think of things like in the Golden Dawn and in Crowley, where you see things like that magical infinite point. Okay, the single point, the atom, or in Thelema, you call it like the hadith. Okay, like the absolute center, right? The point of perception from which you view outward, you know, from which the other is perceived. And that's what life is. It's just that perception, right? And it's like the more you strive for a singular and central perception, you more you can't, because it's an ever fluctuating point of view, right?
Right. Right.
The forms never reach. Yeah, really magical image to say it that way, and really evokes this kind of for those with ears to hear, you know, that deep kind of occultism.
Yeah. And then there's the immolation imagery right at the end, which I love. The victim
Yeah,
with the stake signaling through the flames.
yeah, and if there is one hellish, truly accursed thing in our time, it is our artistic dallying with forms instead of being like victims, burnt at the stake, signaling through the flames. This I find incredibly, incredibly profound, because this is also this idea, right? What is the virgin victim who is sacrificed? Right, what is this person of the sacrifice? Immediately it makes me think of the works of George Bataille, who understood the complexity of this destruction and this pleasure, and becoming the sacrifice is to be absolutely objectified and obliterated in the face of God, you know, or in the face of the goddess, the face of the other, to be consumed in that raw power. And there's something about that transformative action. You know, often the virgins in the mythologies, the ones who get burned at the stake or get destroyed, or are the ones who stand up, and their life and their action, right? They become destroyed, but through that destruction, people are so appalled, it causes this transformation, right? We see that this is at the heart of a lot of activism. In order to bring true transformation, sometimes you have to invoke that violence. You have to show the ugliness. People like Martin Luther King or Gandhi understood this. You know, they sensationalized violence in the media, and they showed the true ugliness of the state weaponry against marginalized people. And that's how they were able to bring about so much transformation, because the average person cannot abide by that kind of violence. You know, and in the same way, we see this in the mythological image of the virgin, who through her sacrifice, through her loss, causes this transformation of everything around her, you know. or him or whoever, right? That sacrificial offering is this powerful transformation of being. And I just keep thinking too, like, Bataille was so obsessed with this, right? He wanted to become sacrificed, right? He had that Aesophal, a magical society where he was trying to set it up so someone would eventually decapitate him, but no one would want to be the the executioner, you know. And he was obsessed with like that image of the lychee, right? Or lychee, which is that it's like this famous image from China where these officials are committing an execution to this man by death by 1,000 cuts. And as he's dying, he's in this like state of ecstasy, of pain and he's crying out, and it almost looks like it's exhilaration. And it's that duality of that experience of death and violence that are so interconnected and at the heart of this magical mystery. And this is really what Artaud is invoking here, right? He's saying, he's like, you're wasting your time with these forms rather than embracing the true power of transformation, rather than embracing death, rather than going through the fiery flames, rather than allowing your ideas to have true transformative power. Like we saw in Artaud's story, he goes through a death and a rebirth, and his work has meaning, his story has meaning, but he had to suffer for that. And so many of us were afraid to walk like that, you know?
Definitely. That's really well said. Thank you.
Sorry for the rant there. I just, you know.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was fascinating. So now we come to the theater and the plague, and I only have a couple short excerpts from this one. This essay, the plague is the theater's double. So the plague, he sees it as like when the plague strikes, all social boundaries, all civil order breaks down, all law breaks down, everything in society breaks down, and people die, and then some people survive, and those people who survive are forever changed.
I mean, he's not wrong, right? We both lived in Ottawa through COVID and through the occupation of the trucker convoy. So we just saw everything kind of like explode for a few months there.
Wow.
Right. And I think everyone to a certain extent witnessed that just by living through the pandemic, you know, and the insanity that is unfoiled because of that, you know. We'll just leave it at that, you know.
Yes, well said. Well said. So the first passage I chose from the theater and its plague, I think, is important, and you'll see why. He's talking about the onset of the illness, and he says the fieriest point is formed at the center of each spot. Around these points, the skin rises in blisters like air bubbles under the surface of lava, and these blisters are surrounded by circles, of which the outermost, like Saturn's ring around the incandescent planet, indicates the extreme limit of a bubo. So I thought this Saturn's ring imagery was important here when talking about the plague, you know?
Yeah, well, we know Saturn is the black sun, right? The inverse of that creation. He's the solar anus, that Dionysian energy refined, that absolute transformative other, that, you know, that anarchic force, right? And this imagery where he's connecting it to the bubonic plague. We got to remember the bubonic plague would appear with these purple rings, like bruises, you know, around a center dot. So that's your Saturn ring, is in your bubonic plague. Creepy. And yeah, you know, Saturn is this slow force of decay. We got to remember, right? That's in the Greek sense, it's in the Roman sense, Chronos Saturn is that force of separation that causes time to unfold, right? I've used this imagery with you a bunch of times, but it's such a good one. It's Saturn is that dark force behind you with the knife, telling you to constantly move forward. And eventually it'll catch up to you. It's like that movie It Follows, and it's just telling you adapt or die.
Yeah.
What?
So this next passage, he says, the plague takes images that are dormant, a latent disorder, and suddenly extends them into the most extreme gestures. The theater also takes gestures and pushes them as far as they will go. Like the plague, it reforges the chain between what is and what is not, between the virtuality of the possible and what already exists in materialized nature. It recovers the notion of symbols and archetypes, which act like silent blows, rests, leaps of the heart, summons of the lymph, inflammatory images thrust into our abruptly wakened heads. The theater restores us all our dormant conflicts and all their powers, and gives these powers names we hail as symbols. And behold, before our eyes is fought a battle of symbols, one charging against another in an impossible melee.
Wow. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect theater and the plague to go together, but it makes sense.
So it's a profoundly intense image, right? And what it like he says here, he says, like the plague, it reforges the chain between what is and what is not, between the virtuality of the possible, what already exists, and materialized nature. It like he's basically describing how the theater kind of infects everything around it and consumes it and incorporates it. It's like this consuming disease force of forcing you to look into that abyss, right? Forcing you to confront the stuff that you don't want to confront. He's really telling you that the theater is this force of confrontation of death, and it will infect everything around you until you confront it. You have to face that shadow, I think.
You do. It's wild stuff.
Right? The theater restores us all our dormant conflicts and all their powers, right? We try to hide from the things that we're afraid of, but the theater puts your monsters on display and gives these powers names we hail as symbols, and behold, before our eyes is fought a battle, right? And sometimes quite literally, you go to the play and there's a literal fight on stage, right? But it's a battle of symbols. It's both symbolic and transformative, but also literal and real and physical. It's an impossible melee, an impossible confrontation of selves, of imagined situations that force you to deal with things outside of yourself.
And inside of yourself.
Right? Through introspection, right? Wow.
And now we come to one of my favorite quotes in the entire book. And the question we must now ask is whether in this slippery world which is committing suicide without noticing it, there can be found a nucleus of men capable of imposing the superior notion of the theater. Men who will restore to all of us the natural and magic equivalent of the dogmas in which we no longer believe.
That is beautiful.
A beautiful statement. And as we'll see later in the text, he does point out a group of people that are doing this real natural magical theater.
So why does this passage stand out so much for you, Graham?
I think it's like this I love the imagery, the slippery world committing a suicide without noticing it. The world dying without even realizing that it's destroying itself. And this desperate plea for someone, anyone, to bring the magic back.
That is such a profound image, right? Like it's so perfectly kind of sums up our current situation, right? Like there's so many things going on. Like we refuse to acknowledge climate change. We refuse to deal with any of the issues with our cities, with the corruption in our governments, with things like Yeah, things like monocultures, right? Like I'm just waiting for like, we live in a super connected world. We just saw what something like the pandemic could cause, right? We have all of these monocultures and people are so interconnected. We're such a massive interwoven species. One disease, one plague, one is all it would take, one serious one, and to cause the complete unraveling of our society. You know, and I don't think we learned the lesson from the last pandemic about this.
No, I don't think so.
It's wild.
Just wild. So now we come to the next essay, which is Metaphysics and the Mise en Scène. And for people not familiar with theater terminology, the mise en scène is sort of like everything in a production that isn't the text. So the play itself is the mise en scène.
Right.
Now he says, in the Louvre, there is a work by a primitive painter, known or unknown, I cannot say, but whose name will never be representative of an important period in the history of art. This painter was Lucas van den Leyden, and in my opinion, he makes the 4 or 5 centuries of painting that come after him inane and useless. The canvas I speak of is entitled The Daughters of Lot, a biblical subject in the style of the period. Of course, the Bible in the Middle Ages was not understood in the same way we understand it today, and this canvas is a curious example of the mystic deductions that can be derived from it. Its emotion, in any case, is visible even from a distance. It affects the mind with an almost thunderous visual harmony, intensely active throughout the painting, yet to be gathered from a single glance. Even before you can discern what is going on, you sense something tremendous happening in the painting, and the ear, one would say, is as moved by it as the eye. The drama of high intellectual importance seems masked there like a sudden gathering of clouds, which the wind or some much more direct fatality has impelled together to measure their thunderbolts. So he's talking about this painting here, Lot and His Daughters by Lucas van den Leyden from 1530. And it's a very striking painting. I can see why he would use this as an example of something with effective mise en scène.
Oh, 100%. And it's just, we were talking about this earlier because you sent me this picture later.
Yeah.
And so I had time just before we came on here to really reflect upon it. And I'm just blown away because it really fully captures the magical and transformative nature of that story of Lot and his daughters, which a lot of modern readers miss. And that's exactly what Artaud was getting at in his text. He was saying that in the medieval ages, they still maintained the mystical, allegorical reading of the text. They were able to understand and connect to these mythopoetic images of magical transformation. And this is what we see firmly at play here. So what we're understanding from this image is that on the right, you have the absolute destruction of a previously decadent society, a society that had started to, commit sexual violence and degradation, and that was wiped out and destroyed in a blaze of apocalyptic glory. That's Sodom. But on the other hand, we have this return to the nature and this rebuilding, this reconnection, this recreation of a new political magical lineage that's done through these women and the magic of these women. The daughters of Lot engage in a ritual magical form where they use a potion to cause Lot to fall asleep so that they can have relations with him and become pregnant. And then they can produce a new lineage and establish a new entire civilization that will grow to the same heights, if not greater, than Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're seeing this magical flipping of the poles, this condemnation and judgment of the past for its sins, and the rebirth and the new created through this magical transformation in these sexual drug rights. And this weird incestuous relationship. But this is something that we see in many stories. I believe we see the same story reflected later in the mythology of Jesus Christ. We also see this in the story of Diana and Lucifer, as told like in Charles Leland's The Gospel of Witches, Aradia. Anyway, there are many examples of this kind of pole flipping magic and this establishment of these new political transformational lineages through these sexual magical rites that are driven by women. And this is what Artaud's hinting at. And it's amazing to me that he such a dragon move to point this magical image out and to talk about how this is the greatest painting of the last 500 years. You know?
Yeah. Very Artaud in every respect. Even the incest, because like Lechenchi, his play The Theatre of Cruelty, deals with those themes, and
but it really it highlights things we talked about earlier tonight, right? Like the collapse, the inevitability, seeing the decadence and the destructive nature of the city, like the fact that our society is slowly committing suicide, right? That's what people were witnessing with this image with the Sodom and Gomorrah, which do get destroyed because of their decadence. And then we have the image of Lot and his daughters returning to this primitive way of nature, right? They're living in tents, they're going back out into the wilderness, so. And the drugs, they got the drugs. She's mixing the drugs right there. So
yeah, right in plain view,
right. So
yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that painting. So now, if we go partway down the page here, dialogue, a thing written and spoken, does not belong specifically to the stage. It belongs to books, as is proved by the fact that in all handbooks of literary history, a place is reserved for the theater as a subordinate branch of the history of the spoken language. I say that the stage is a concrete physical place which asks to be filled and to be given its own concrete language to speak. I say that this concrete language, intended for the senses and independent of speech, has first to satisfy the senses, that there is a poetry of the senses as there is a poetry of language, and that this concrete physical language to which I refer is truly theatrical only to the degree that the thoughts it expresses are beyond the reach of the spoken language. Then he says, just to conclude his thought, this very difficult and complex poetry assumes many aspects, especially the aspect of all the means of expression utilizable on the stage: music, dance, plastic art, pantomime, mimicry, gesticulation, intonation, architecture, lighting, and scenery. So he's saying here in these passages that theater has lost its magic because it's too dependent now on dialogue, and how these other aspects of the production, the lighting, the scenery, the intonation, just how you're saying the words, is no longer important. And that's where the true magic of the theater lies.
Yeah, the theater, right? It's a totality. It's about this recreation. I often think I really love a lot of Indian theater, and I was really moved. Like, if you look at a lot of like Indian traditional theater, it's about like invoking this totality of the senses and driving you into the scene, and like recreating. You're supposed to, as a viewer, you're supposed to engage with the performance in a meditative form, so that you also become transported by the art, and like these are people who are trying to create like modern video games and modern movies, with what they had access to, basically.
Yeah.
The point is that the theater is many incorporates all the senses, not just your ability to speak.
It is nothing because it's in everything, as he says earlier, right?
Exactly.
So he says it is plain that these signs constitute true hieroglyphs, in which man, to the extent that he contributes to their formation, is only a form like the rest, yet to which, because of his double nature, he adds a singular prestige. This language, which evokes in the mind images of an intense natural or spiritual poetry, provides a good idea of what a poetry in space independent of spoken language could mean in the theater.
Wow. These signs constitute true hieroglyphs in which man, to the extent he contributes to formulation, is only a form like the rest, to which, because of his double nature, he adds. So he's getting at this idea that all of these signs are born of the body. They're born of these representations of people just, raw emotion, this desperation to express to one another. And what he's trying to return to is this almost this before language, this primitive emotional connection that only theater has access to by having access to everything.
Exactly. And he's talking about, developing eventually codes so that these signs can be recognized by the audience immediately, like mythical symbols in ancient times. And so they can focus on not what are these symbols, but how are the symbols going to play out this time.
Right. That's such a profound thing.
Trying to create new archetypes.
Right. And I think about this often because we take a lot of signs and symbols for granted and we don't even think about them, like idioms. Imagine trying to translate an idiom into a foreign language, or like how we just assume people know signs. Like I was talking to this amazing ancient historian named Dr. Carla Ionescu. And she's writing a book right now about Artemis at Ephesus, which is this really famous historical site. And there's a statue of Artemis that was present there that became kind of like definitive. Everyone copied this statue. And the statue had, hundreds or dozens of these lumps all over its chest. Okay. And no one mentions in any of the ancient literature what these lumps are. Okay. They're just taken for granted. But, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years go by. And then by the time you get to the Roman era, they're depicted as breasts. And then by the time you get to the modern era, historians are like trying to figure out and debate and see what they are. And I'm asking Dr. Carla, I'm like, so what are these lumps? What are these lumps? And she's like, well, they're bee eggs. And I'm like, they're bee eggs? It's like, yeah, because Artemis is the queen bee. Even her priests at the temple are called the beekeepers. And, if you look at bee eggs, they look exactly like bee eggs. They're absolutely not breasts because the Greeks loved, breasts and would have told you or would have painted them, right? And, and it's like, what she was saying is like she thinks like they were just so well understood as this bee image, and people were so familiar with bees because they would have had access and been around, that they just understood this image, so they never needed to talk about it. It didn't need to be written down in the books, right? Didn't need to be mentioned that they were bee eggs. Then hundreds of years later, we have all these people who have no idea what the hell's going on.
It's wild.
Anyway, just an interesting little tangent.
Yeah, no, I love it. So next he says, the contemporary theater is decadent because it has lost the feeling on the one hand for seriousness and on the other for laughter. Because it has broken away from gravity, from effects that are immediate and painful, in a word, from danger. Because it has lost a sense of real humor, a sense of laughter's power of physical and anarchic dissociation.
That's beautiful.
You have to be able to laugh. If you can't laugh, you'll be destroyed, right?
Right. And that's the magic of Dionysus. Dionysus is that god who's constantly laughing and reveling, right? He brings that madness, that silliness that tells you to just keep going, no matter how hard or ridiculous or impossible or confusing or terrifying. And also, right, laughter has this magical power to disarm and to disassociate, to destroy, to break things down. You ever feeling like shit, just laugh about something. You ever scared, laugh at it, right? Like it's especially if there's a group of people, it's wild that the power that group laughter can have, even if it starts out as forced. It's like it's this instinctual primal force of transformation. It's a way for us to look danger in the face and confront it. It's a superpower, right? It allows us to just to stand in the face of ridiculousness and to say this is ridiculous, right? Like what else can you do but laugh, right?
Yeah, you have to laugh. Ah. And so this last passage in this section, I'm not going to read all of it. Just the point is that the last sentence, to consider language as the form of incantation. And so he's talking about not removing dialogue from the theater, but reapproaching how we use it with intonation to create a form of incantatory effect.
Beautiful.
And so then we come to the next essay on the Balinese theater. So he actually got to see a production of some Balinese theater that came to Paris, I believe, in 1931 or 1932. And he was deeply moved by this. And he said, holy shit, these are the people that have been doing this all along, that I've been writing about, this theater, this magical theater that I've been talking about. These people are doing it now.
That's so beautiful. Wow. I would have loved to have seen him after he saw some Balinese theater. That's amazing.
I know. So I'm not going to read all of this. Just
Okay.
the spectacle of the Balinese theater, which draws upon dance, song, pantomime, and a little of the theater as we understand it in the Occident, restores the theater by means of ceremonies of indubitable age and well-tried efficacy to its original destiny, which it presents as a combination of all these elements fused together in a perspective of hallucination and fear. It is very remarkable that the first of the little plays which compose the spectacle, in which we are shown a father's remonstrances to his tradition-flouting daughter, begins with an entrance of phantoms. The male and female characters who will develop a dramatic but familiar subject appear to us first in their spectral aspect, and are seen in that hallucinatory perspective appropriate to every theatrical character.
That's so interesting because he's basically, they're doing the theater and it's double, right? The actors first appear as their double, as the like this imaginary form, this kind of grotesque form, and then they appear as themselves. That's interesting. Whoa.
It is. And I'd just like to keep moving forward here because
Mhm.
this next passage is really interesting. He says, what is in fact curious about all these gestures, these angular and abruptly abandoned attitudes, these syncopated modulations formed at the back of the throat, these musical phrases that break off short, these flights of elytra, these rustlings of branches, these sounds of hollow drums, these robotic squeakings, these dances of animated mannequins, is this: that through the labyrinth of their gestures, attitudes, and sudden cries, through the gyrations and turns which leave no portion of the stage space unutilized, the sense of a new physical language, based upon signs and no longer upon words, is liberated. These actors, with their geometric robes, seem to be animated hieroglyphs. It is not just the shape of their robes which, displacing the axis of the human figure, create beside the dress of these warriors in a state of trance and perpetual war, a kind of second symbolic dress, and thus inspire an intellectual idea, or which merely connect by all the intersections of the lines with all the intersections of perspective in space. So that's very wordy, but all he's saying is that they're using their costumes, the lighting, the sound, the stage, the props, everything is creating a new language of hieroglyphs.
Yeah, he's talking about how they're telling the story through the totality of their performance, not simply through their dialogue. The dialogue is secondary. You know, it's part. It's a part of the fabric of the play, which utilizes all of these aspects.
Exactly. And then he says, and for the lovers of realism at all costs, who might find exhausting these perpetual allusions to secret attitudes inaccessible to thought, there remains the eminently realistic play of the double, who is terrified by the apparitions from beyond.
Interesting.
And so we have the regular drama that's unfolding on stage, and then the cosmic drama of these symbols unfolding at the same time.
And you know what? That's something that's really profound because it's also something that we see in so much of the ancient literature and the ancient theater is this idea of having metaphor and then extended metaphor and the literal meaning. You know, so every performance would be seen in these multitudes of understanding. You have the initial immediate drama that is unfolding in front of you, but then you have the symbolic metaphor that's this higher meaning that's dramatically playing behind you. You know, it's wild.
Exactly. It's fascinating stuff. And we'll skip ahead 2 slides here. I just like to read the last sentence. The hieratic quality of the costumes gives each actor a double body and a double set of limbs, and the dancer bundled into his costume seems to be nothing more than his own effigy.
Wow. So he's his own stand-in, his own sacrificial form. That's crazy. Interesting.
Very interesting stuff. So now we come to his first manifesto of the Theatre of Cruelty, where he says, this language cannot be defined except by its possibilities for dynamic expression in space, as opposed to the expressive possibilities of spoken dialogue. And what the theater can still take over from speech are its possibilities for extension beyond words, for development in space, for dissociative and vibratory action upon the sensibility. This is the age, this is the hour of intonations, of a word's particular pronunciation. Here too intervenes the visual language of objects, movements, attitudes, and gestures, but on condition that their meanings, their physiognomies, their combinations be carried out to the point of becoming signs, making a kind of alphabet out of these signs. Once aware of this language in space, language of sounds, cries, lights, onomatopoeia, the theater must organize it into veritable hieroglyphs with the help of characters and objects and make use of their symbolism and interconnections in relation to all organisms on all levels. Then I'll jump ahead a bit. He says
Okay.
these ideas, which touch on creation, becoming, and chaos, are all of the cosmic order and furnish a primary notion of a domain from which the theater is now entirely alien. They are able to create a kind of passionate equation between man, society, nature, and objects.
That's so interesting. Yeah, he's getting at this idea, right? That the theater, because of its, you know, its ability to recreate all of these forms, it can really have this dialogue between all of these different aspects of our culture, right?
Exactly. So then he gets into something of what the spectacle might actually look like. And I'm not going to read all of the next couple pages, I'm just going to touch on little highlights. So every spectacle will contain a physical and objective element perceptible to all. Cries, groans, apparitions, surprises, theatricalities of all kinds, magic beauty of costumes taken from certain ritual models, resplendent lighting, incantational beauty of voices, the charms of harmony, rare notes of music, colors of objects, physical rhythm of movements whose crescendo and decrescendo will accord exactly with the pulsation of movements familiar to everyone. He's talking about using masks, effigies yards high, sudden changes of light, and the physical action of light which arouses sensations of heat and cold.
Interesting. Wow.
And Yeah, I'm not gonna read all of this. This is more just like a reference point for me. Um, Meanwhile, new means of recording this language must be found, whether these means belong to musical transcription or to some kind of code. As for ordinary objects, or even the human body, raised to the dignity of signs, it is evident that one can draw one's inspiration from hieroglyphic characters, not only in order to record these signs in a readable fashion which permits them to be reproduced at will, but in order to compose on the stage precise and immediately readable symbols.
Interesting.
Similarly, Similarly, the 10,001 expressions of the face caught in the form of masks can be labeled and cataloged so they may eventually participate directly and symbolically in this concrete language of the stage.
That's such an interesting kind of idea. Can you imagine that, creating 10,000 masks of all these different human facial expressions and then trying to have like a concrete language of the stage? It's a daunting task, but it's interesting that that's kind of where he was going for. He wanted to kind of, there's something about this creation of this of language itself that was magical, you know?
Definitely. And he saw it in the Balinese theater, and his one of his theater collaborators was like, "Oh, we shouldn't be appropriating Balinese culture into our theater." And he's like, "It's not about taking their elements. It's about borrowing that concept of using these universal signs and creating our own signs."
Right. Understanding, right? Like you don't have to take what they did. You can just be inspired. You can have a play within a play. You can have the cosmic drama be represented in your own symbolic formulation. I love
Exactly.
that.
Because
Yeah.
their formulation of language might not make sense to these people or to these people or to these people, right? You need to address your public in their own language.
Yeah, and you may need to, and there's something to be said about this constant recreation and reformulation, because like we said, signs often take on too many meanings and they become bloated, so you need to create new images, you know?
Hmm. And so now he comes to what he actually means by cruelty. And these are a few excerpts from a couple letters that he wrote. One can very well imagine a pure cruelty without bodily laceration. And philosophically speaking, what indeed is cruelty? From the point of view of the mind, cruelty signifies rigor, implacable intention and decision, irreversible and absolute determination. Cruelty is above all lucid, a kind of rigid control and submission to necessity. There is no cruelty without consciousness and without the application of consciousness. It is consciousness that gives to the exercise of every act of life its blood red color, its cruel nuance, since it is understood that life is always someone's death.
That is so wild, and I need to point out something here. This is
Yeah.
for all of our Greco-Roman fans here. Cruelty is above all lucid, a kind of rigid control and submission to necessity. So, this idea of necessity, in some versions of the Orphic cosmogony, the force that impels Phanes to rip himself apart is called ananke, or necessity. It's this female force of kind of erotic, transformative energy. Sometimes it's this cosmogonic eros, but often it's ananke, necessity itself. Necessity causes Phanes, out of this desperation to know, to experience the other, out of this loneliness and pain, to rip themselves apart, to experience love, to be able to have that sexual union. But by doing so, he's created this separation. You know, he's divided himself. And there's now this unfolding and this perpetuation of creation that is a result of this action. This necessity brings about this constant cruelty, this constant suffering that eventually will lead the one to return back to itself. But then the cycle will repeat again because of this necessity for the other. It's this desire to come together, but when you come together, there's this retraction, you know?
Yeah.
Wow. Beautiful magical imagery from Artaud.
Very. So the next letter, you're going to love this one. Dear friend, I confess to you I neither understand nor admit the objections that have been made against my title. For it seems to me that creation and life itself are defined only by a kind of rigor, hence a fundamental cruelty, which leads things to their ineluctable end at whatever cost. Effort is a cruelty. Existence through effort is a cruelty. Rising from his repose and extending himself into being, Brahma suffers, with a suffering that yields joyous harmonics perhaps, but which at the ultimate extremity of the curve can only be expressed by a terrible crushing and grinding. There is in life's flame, life's appetite, life's irrational impulsion, a kind of initial perversity. The desired characteristic of Eros is cruelty, since it feeds upon contingencies. Death is cruelty. Resurrection is cruelty. Transfiguration is cruelty, since nowhere in a circular and closed world is there room for true death, since ascension is a rending, since closed space is fed with lives, and each stronger life tramples down the others, consuming them in a massacre which is a transfiguration into bliss. In the manifested world, metaphysically speaking, evil is a permanent law, and what is good is an effort and already one more cruelty added to the other.
As if he invokes Eros. So,
I knew you would love that.
so of course he knows about an Anki. He's using this language. He this people always underestimated Artaud. That man is so well read, and if you know what to look for in his writings, you will see it everywhere. And yeah, this is just another beautiful example of this. And he's really evoking these primordial kind of mythopoetic images of this destruction, of this unfolding of creation, of this creative violence, and of oh wow. And it's almost very Buddhist of him too. It really reminds me in some ways, this idea of the understanding of life as this cruelty, right? One of the noble truths is that life is suffering. Artaud would totally agree. He would cling to life in spite of the suffering, because of the suffering. He thinks the suffering is good.
Yeah. Not in the passage that we read the other day, not in the fury, but in the fervor.
Right? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
So then he finishes his letter off. He says, not to understand this is not to understand metaphysical ideas.
Oh wow.
And after this, let no one come to tell me my title is too limited. It is cruelty that cements matter together, cruelty that molds the features of the created world. Good is always upon the outer face, but the face within is evil. Evil which will eventually be reduced, but at the supreme instant when everything that was formed will be on the point of returning to chaos.
Wow. Yeah, he is so clearly influenced by various forms of Eastern and Indian thought here. And it's so beautiful. And I just love this idea, right? And this idea that it's that force of the cruelty that is that driving force. That, think about it this way too, right? From a biological level, what is the defining aspects of what it is to be human? I would say it's to fear death and to be reactive against death. And then it's to be driven to a certain extent by that biological nature to procreate and to protect the species, whether it's that communal drive or that drive to create children, but these things are they're born out, they cause this unfolding of constant suffering, they cause this constant kind of perpetuation of more and more violence upon themselves.
Exactly.
And it will eventually be reduced, but at that supreme instance, when everything that was form will be on the point of returning to chaos, right? To return to the one is also to return to that chaos gap, that cosmic womb, right? That nix, you know?
There's no evil or good if there's only one being, right? It's
No,
the merging of all things.
there's just the unfolding of creation, right? And there's that cruelty. We're cruel to ourselves because we don't recognize our divine being. We do it to ourselves, right? That's basically what Artaud has been constantly getting at. But it's
Exactly.
also worth it for that experience, to experience that other, to experience that creation, to sing a song. It's like, yeah, well, it's wild and profound and dark and scary.
Very. So we're almost at the end here. This is his the last section in the book that I talk about. His second manifesto of the Theatre of Cruelty. And here he talks about a potential scenario. So, like a theater scenario for what a production of the Theatre of Cruelty could be. And it's a very long section, so I only took his setup of it.
Okay.
Basically, and because we've already talked about what the production kind of looks like. But I think it's important to talk about the content.
Of course.
So the first spectacle of the Theatre of Cruelty will be entitled "The Conquest of Mexico." Again, going back to Mexico, right? He's obsessed with Mexico. It will stage events, not men. Men will come in their turn with their psychology and their passions, but they will be taken as the emanation of certain forces and understood in the light of the events and historical fatality in which they have played their role. This subject has been chosen, one, because of its immediacy and all the allusions it permits to problems of vital interest for Europe and the world. From the historical point of view, the conquest of Mexico poses the question of colonization. It revives in a brutal and implacable way the ever-active fatuousness of Europe. It permits her idea of her own superiority to be deflated. It contrasts Christianity with much older religions. It corrects the false conception the Occident has somehow formed concerning paganism and certain natural religions. And it underlines with burning emotion the splendor and forever immediate poetry of the old metaphysical sources on which these religions are built.
Oh, wow.
Should I keep going?
Yeah. I'm just like, it corrects the false conceptions the Occident has somehow formed concerning paganism and certain natural resistance, underlines the burning emotion and the splendor and forever immediate poetry of the old metaphysical sources on which these religions are built. I love this so much. It's such a great image, and it's something that can't be stressed enough. It's like so much of our Western idea has dismissed a lot of these ancient and non-Western animistic and in different forms of religions and spiritualities, but often these are they're primordial, their image, they're like there's a deep connection to the natural element and to the human connections. They're not these philosophical things that are removed. Like he experienced it in Mexico when he goes through those rites, right? When he did the peyote rite and he's dancing with those 6-7 people, right?
Exactly.
So it's like, yeah, in one instance they don't have the Bible, but we don't have the peyote rites. Right?
Everyone has a different means of expressing and connecting to that all, and they're all valid.
Exactly. Well said.
In one of his texts, I can't remember which one it is, it might be Heliogabalus, he says, "Who does not see that all these esoterisms are the same, that they strive to reconnect us with nature and with life itself?"
Right? They are all the same, and they do all strive to reconnect us to nature and life itself, and all of these images are different and of the same. They're representatives of individual human experiences, and our it's this. Life is so complicated and hard, and we try to like contain and conform and define that which cannot be contained, conformed, or defined. But there's also something beautiful in the attempt.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
So to continue his idea here, he says, 2, by broaching the alarmingly immediate question of colonization and the right one continent thinks it has to enslave another, this subject questions the real superiority of certain races over others and shows the inmost filiation that binds the genius of a race to particular forms of civilization. He contrasts the tyrannical anarchy of the colonizers to the profound moral harmony of the as yet uncolonized. We're on slide 30. We're on slide 36 if you're lost.
Slide 36. Oh, which one am I on now? Oh, okay. There we go. All right.
Further, by contrast with the disorder of the it'll be 37 for you because you have the painting.
No worry.
So further, by contrast with the disorder of the European monarchy of the time, based upon the crudest and most unjust material principles, it illuminates the organic hierarchy of the Aztec monarchy established on indisputable spiritual principles. From the social point of view, it shows the peacefulness of a society which knew how to feed all its members, and in which the revolution had been accomplished from the very beginnings. Out of this clash of moral disorder and Catholic monarchy with pagan order, the subject can set off unheard of explosions of forces and images, sown here and there with brutal dialogues. Men battling hand to hand, bearing within themselves like stigmata the most opposed ideas. The moral grounds and the immediacy of interest of such a spectacle being sufficiently stressed, let us emphasize the value as spectacle of the conflicts it will set upon the stage. There were first of all the inner struggles of Moctezuma, the divided king concerning whose motivations history has been unable to enlighten us. His struggles and his symbolic discussion with the visual myths of astrology will be shown in an objective pictorial fashion. Then besides him there are the crowd, the different social strata, the revolt of the people against destiny as represented by Moctezuma, the clamoring of the unbelievers, the quibbling of the philosophers and priests, the lamentations of the poets, the treachery of the merchants and the bourgeoisie.
That's so wild. Okay, so what do you think of that final, like the final part here? What do you think he's getting at?
Which part specifically?
I realized that I forgot. Oh, you dropped for a second there.
Yeah.
So I don't actually have the last page here.
Slide by accident. Sorry.
I put up the wrong. Yeah, I have the wrong slide. I don't know if that was my fault. It doesn't matter. It could have been either of us, but either way, we got the last slide mixed up there, so I can't review the text. But
no worries.
Yeah.
I think it's just again emphasizing. He's showing that it's really the Catholic conquistador, colonizers that are the brutal, barbaric ones, and not the Aztecs or the Mesoamericans.
Yeah.
Have a very civilized culture, and then these people come and brutalize them. And it's about the war of these different principles.
Yeah. And it's just so wild, that whole colonialist aspect, that idea of like trying to force everyone to conform to your will. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a terrifying thing. Like, and in terms of like Latin America, I always think of like the Requimento, right? That document that the conquistadors used to read to the indigenous peoples in Spanish, which they could not understand, basically saying, we require you to submit to Christ, or we're going to brutalize you and take everything from you and enslave you. And it's just like so terrifying,
It is brutal and horrifying. And I'd just like to close off with the last scene of the conquest of Mexico. He says, And like a tidal wave, like the sharp burst of a storm, like the whipping of rain on the sea, the revolt which carries off the whole crowd in groups with the body of the dead Motekazuma tossed on their heads like a ship, and the sharp spasms of the battle, the foam of the heads of the cornered Spaniards who are squashed like blood against the ramparts that are turning green again. So it's like at the end, the bloodshed results in some sort of rebirth of some kind, with the ramparts turning green again. The blood subsides, but as we know, what comes is not necessarily the best for them in that instance. But
No, right? There's always these transformations, right? These powers, these cycles of death and rebirth, right? And of cultural decadence and eventual decay, and this refusal of transformation, and this the continue of hubris. It's this very human story that we see represented in myth and theater and poetry and literature across time. And I think that largely is what Artaud is connecting to, is this understanding of this necessity for this ability to reinvent oneself, to become that sacrificial virgin and to transform, rather than to become that tyrannical colonizing force that leads to this stagnation, that then results in its own destruction, that becomes like the decadent theater that he was railing against.
exactly, well said.
Yeah, crazy. But that was such an amazing book. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that with us, the theater in its double. So, what is your main takeaway from this particular collection?
My main takeaway from this collection would be that there are powers and forces that can reconnect you to yourself and to your world. We aren't alone. We aren't separated by ourselves. We aren't isolated in this world. We can connect. And it's about tapping into that magic and overcoming that pain and that isolation and the fear of judgment, and trying to form community or form bonds with yourself.
Right. And I think Artaud was also right. This idea of the theater of cruelty is about facing that reality of suffering. It's about facing the injustices of our universe. It's the same thing that we see with tragedy in the Greek theater, about learning to face and confront the shame and the raw visceral violence in order to transform it, to be able to lessen it through the lens of the theater. We can then face the unknown with less uncertainty, and we can transform and imagine something else, something greater, so ourselves overcoming the suffering, ourselves growing as a community. We gain this language. Language is this form of unity and of growth and of description, and so much of this is about creating this language through which to understand and confront and adapt to that cruelty, right?
Right. And he believed that through this type of theater, it would shock humanity out of the complacency of their false world and liberate their instinctual energy. And if each person underwent this profound transformation, society by nature would not be the same anymore. And our worlds would not be the same. And that's what he was trying to, that's the revolution that Artaud wanted.
Yeah, he wanted that personal revolution of the self, that rebirth where we forced to face our own inevitable death, to die while we're alive, so that then we can overcome fear. And when we're no longer bound by fear, we can truly embrace that reason, and we can face reality in this more confrontational, more united front. And that, I think that was Artaud's big issue with a lot of socialism, because he had many of the same beliefs fundamentally about how people should be free, but he felt that us as a community, until we could deal with this loss of the instinct, with this inability to face death, with this disconnection from the natural world, until we could learn to face those wounds and attempt to heal them, we would never be able to enter any kind of a proper egalitarian or equal society in any form, regardless of your political ideology, you know?
Exactly. He believed that the revolution, transcended political boundaries. And, he says in on Mexico and Civilization, one of his essays or his lectures, he says it's right to redistribute wealth and land, it's right to redistribute power, but until we fundamentally change as human beings, these political shifts are nothing more than mere transferences of tyranny.
Yeah. Tyranny will find another way in which to wield its ugly head, you know? Those tyrants will find a way to rise to the top and to set up systems of control to benefit them, you know?
I have a passage here from a letter that he wrote to Arthur Adamov, if you don't mind me reading this short
Of
passage.
course.
He says, "And dead one must pass, even a volcano, through many repressions and many gulfs, many doors of torture, before exploding as one would like, because I want what I write to make something explode in the consciousness. But I want the thing that explodes in the consciousness to make something explode outside of it. Earth, war, nations, dialects, and epidemics." So he's
Wow.
talking about using art to create literal changes in society and physical changes in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. To bring about this kind of confrontation with that other, to force these kind of, we all see the writing on the walls. We all see the issues, the gaping holes that need to be filled. And there's something to be said about causing, you have to make people look before the wall falls, right? But that was so much fun. Always loved talking Artaud, and this was our third talk. Plus, we did that full two-part
episode. Yeah, so we've got a lot of Artaud. Sorry, everyone, but he's just a fascinating character, and he has such a breadth of work.
Yeah, and he's kind of this quintessential magical character, this artist and magician who's very upfront, and he's modern in his approach, but still grounded in antiquity and in that natural animism that we love to see. And in my mind, he's still one of the most quintessential kind of dragons that people were looking for, someone who's using magic to transform their art, their life, and their reality. That's Artaud. But we're going to come back to him again, at least one more time. Maybe not for a few weeks, but we'll see what happens, because Graham, you have a really interesting Artaud book. We've referenced it on the channel. It's called Heliogabalus. Can you show? Do you have it with you?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'll grab it.
Yeah.
Because it's such a beautiful book.
Exactly. I want people to see the cover. So for people who don't know, Heliogabalus is a Romanized name for the emperor Elagabalus, who was an Assyrian emperor of Rome and famously underwent magical gender-altering rites to become a female or a non-binary person. It's very complicated, and so much of their life is obscured by propaganda, so it's hard to say exactly. But they are a magical, gender-bending, transformative person, you know?
And here is Heliogabalus, or the Crowned Anarchist, published by Infinity Land Press. This is the 2022 edition. It was first published in 2019. This is the first complete translation in English of this work.
Yeah.
By Alexis Lykiard. And introduction by Stephen Barber. And we'll be doing a nice deep dive into this work because it is profoundly magical, and it's the perfect jumping point from his theater, from talking about Theatre of Cruelty into Heliogabalus, because it was written during the same time.
And I know I'm going to have a lot to say because I love the character of Elagabalus. Anyone who knows me knows that one of my, my patron deity is Cybele, the same deity that Elagabalus was the high priestess for. So there's a lot of overlap and interest here. So we're going to have fun talking about Elagabalus, Heliogabalus. It's such a wild story. And it gets us into some serious magic, real transformative magic.
Yeah.
Some of the most powerful people on earth, right? Elagabalus was the emperor of Rome for a short period,
Yeah.
And they were the leader of the cult of Cybele, which at that time, the cult of the Great Mother, was the most powerful religion in all of the Mediterranean, if not the world. So
it's kind of like the original Pope.
Exactly, right? Similar kind of idea. All right, Graham. Well, that was so much fun. Oh, also, I wanted to mention that I'm going to be doing another episode too for Searching for Dragons. The issue, well, it's a good issue to have, but we're always talking about all of these amazing artists I want to talk about. So I had brought up, there's the Black feminist theater performer and dancer, Notakaze Shange, I believe is how you say her name. I wanted to talk about there. I wanted to do an episode on Sappho. I was thinking of Lord Byron is another potential one to do. J.K. Huysman, who wrote Down There, Là-bas, which has a satanic mass. I wanted to do an episode on him, which would be pretty cool. There's so many incredible artists and magicians out there to talk about. Ella Wheeler Wilcox, I wanted to talk about, who is an American poet, really famous because she was a part of the New Thought in the Theosophical movement. But she wrote some of the most famous, what's the line? It's going to bug me now. She wrote one of the most famous poetical lines in human history, which is from her poem Solitude. Where is it here? It says, "Laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone." So I'm sure you've heard it, but no one knows who Ella Wheeler Wilcox is. Even though she was this incredible journalist and this magical figure, she was a member of the Rosicrucians, of the Theosophical Society of New Thought. A really interesting person. Anyway, lots of cool people to talk about. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a poll up on our Discord. If you're not on our Discord, it's called Myth and Lore. There's links in the description below. But come join there and we'll have a poll up and you can help us decide which artist, author we talk about next. That'll be fun. Yeah. And then we're not going to be here on Saturday because Graham has other things, but I'm going to be doing on Saturday a tarot session with my good friend Buffy for the full moon. So that'll be fun.
Awesome.
So I hope to see you guys still on Saturday. And then we're back on Sunday with Occult Explorers for the Epicurean Guide to Lucifer Part 2. And Graham, I almost forgot to tell you, but this afternoon, look what came in the mail for me.
Yes, I was wondering if those got there yet or not.
Yeah, wonderful. So these are Graham's 2 latest chapter books that he released. You Only Die Once, which is your collection of short stories, right?
Yeah.
And then Abyssal Metaphysics. And we've done deep dives into both of these books, and you can purchase them on your website. Links are all below. Yeah. This, I believe, is my favorite of your work that I've got, and so I'm so excited. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
This one.
I'm glad.
So thank you so much for sending me those, and they made it all the way up to middle of nowhere, Ontario. So
I had a feeling they'd get there, but I was wondering. I was like, "Oh, it's been longer than usual."
well, you know. But do you have anything new in the works that's coming anytime soon?
Not really right now. Just, I mean, Sacred Armaments is coming out soon. Methystani is coming out soon, and my EP with my friend. And so same project, same stuff as last time. Really, nothing too new on the horizon. Just trying to focus on getting these projects that are already in the works finished.
But amazing stuff. Abyssal Metaphysics is a wild one. Sacred Armaments is a wild one that's coming. That's going to be so fun. The EP you're doing with your friend, I'm excited about. You also have new music from your band on the way, so that'll be a lot of fun. Always new cool projects coming from Graham.
Yeah.
So
there's something new. I'm starting a black metal project with a friend. Lo-fi black metal.
Lo-fi.
Lo-fi black metal. We're calling it Wind and Fog. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm excited. I'm sure it's going to be the most true, grim, and necro ancient occult thing I've ever heard. I can't wait to see the music video of you guys in corpse paint filmed on a broken VHS running through the woods. No, I honestly though, you have great taste in black metal, so I know it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to that project. That sounds interesting.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. This has been Searching for Dragons, and tune in next time. And don't forget, come onto the Discord and help us select our the next author we hope to talk about. So, peace and love, everyone. Any last words, Graham?
Just laugh in the face of suffering and keep on trucking.
Laugh in the face of suffering, everyone. Take care. I love you all. Good night.